I'm lying here staring at the ceiling, and all I can think is how I wish I'd kept my mouth shut that night or my moans. Rather, it sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. Faking an orgasm so my husband would stop. Who does that? But the truth is, I did. And I remember every second of it. The hesitation, the guilt, the odd sense of relief as soon as it was over. It wasn't even that Mark was doing something terrible. It was just, I didn't feel anything. Or maybe I felt something I didn't like. There was a heaviness between us, and I couldn't articulate it, so I just pulled the curtain down on the whole scene. When he looked at me afterward, I felt a little pulse of panic. The way his eyes searched my face made me think he knew. But it passed so quickly. He's always been a considerate man, one who'd rather trust than pry, and in that moment I exhaled. I remember thinking, well, that's done. Maybe next time will be better. It never occurred to me that it might be the last time. Even now, I can't say when exactly he stopped trying. A week later, 2 weeks, maybe. I just know I woke up one morning and something was different in the way he carried himself, as if a quiet realization had settled in his mind. It's not that he became cold or distant. If anything, he was the same kind Mark one married, offering me coffee in the morning, making sure I had my keys before leaving the house. It was almost worse because he was so gentle, so normal. No big fights, no accusations, just a sense that the door we always kept open had silently swung shut. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line I didn't see. Or maybe I did see it, and I walked right over it. The memory of that night kept replaying in my mind, even as I convinced myself it was no big deal. I had done it to spare him, right? Spare him or spare me. The more I thought about it, the more I questioned which of us I was really protecting. I started noticing how he didn't linger in the bedroom as often, how he'd drift off to sleep quickly or sometimes go downstairs to read. He wasn't angry. His routine was just different. One afternoon, I caught myself watching him from across the room, waiting for him to notice me. When he finally turned and smiled, it was a polite smile, the one you give a stranger who's taken a seat too close on the bus. I felt a rush of something: shame, regret, longing. I'm not sure. I wanted to shout, "Do you still want me?" But I couldn't because I was terrified his answer might confirm my worst fears. And so I tried to shake it off. I acted normal, holding his hand at the grocery store, hugging him for no reason. He'd hug me back always, but never more than that. I kept telling myself it was in my head, that we'd just hit a slow patch. But each little sign was adding up, each day a reminder of the single moment that might have changed everything. And the question that gnawed at me was, did I break this for good? I used to think of Mark as predictable in the best way, reliable, steady, the rock who never failed to show up. That was part of his charm when we first met. There was comfort in knowing he'd always listen, always hold my hand through a storm. Over the years, though, that stability began to feel like a slow suffocation. Not that he was doing anything wrong, but I guess I wanted more spark, more excitement. Maybe I was bored with my own life, projecting that onto him. I'm not proud of admitting that, but it's the truth. And I think maybe deep down, I resented him for not shaking things up. It's like every day was the same, and I was waiting for a grand gesture that never came. Funny how I never made one myself. Instead, I let this quiet dissatisfaction build inside me, telling myself I was just tired or stressed. I used to imagine these dramatic scenes where I confessed my unhappiness. He'd fight for me, and we'd tumble into a passionate resolution. But life isn't a romance movie, and he's not the type to wrestle me into wanting him. He's always respected my boundaries, taken me at my word, and offered gentle reassurance when I seemed off. So when I faked it that night, I justified it by telling myself I was too exhausted to perform. But the real reason was more complicated. I wanted to end it because I felt nothing. Worse than nothing. I felt angry, as if it was his fault I couldn't get excited. Afterward, I lay there feeling guilty, but also oddly powerful, thinking, there, that's done. I thought if I pretended it was great, maybe we'd fool each other into believing it was. But I never considered that he'd see through it and simply let me slip away. It's almost ironic. All this time, I was craving him to do something different, something unexpected. But when I forced a resolution, he took me at face value, as he always does, and accepted what I did as the truth of what I wanted. I keep telling myself, this isn't final, we can still salvage it. But how do you salvage something that's become a silent agreement? The words, let me go, never passed my lips, yet it feels like that's what I told him. I spent my days replying every small gesture. The way I casually kissed his cheek, the way he patted my shoulder like a friend, not a lover. Did I flinch? Did I make him think I didn't want him anymore? It's like living in a house with all the windows open on a cold night. There's a chill everywhere, and I'm the one who left them open. The shame and frustration mix until I can't even tell them apart. I find myself rationalizing that maybe all couples go through this, that we just need time, but I can't escape the sense that something fundamental changed. I keep wanting to ask him, are we okay? But I'm terrified he'll look at me with that same calm acceptance and say, I don't think so. And what would I do then? It might be better not to ask, to pretend we're drifting on the same gentle current. Except, I'm the only one drowning. And maybe the hardest part is realizing he has no idea how desperately I'm flailing. Or worse, he does know and he's letting me flail because that's what I told him I wanted. So I wander around the house with this ache in my chest, wondering if it's already too late to come back from where I took us. I remember the day it really sank in that he wasn't coming to me for sex anymore. It was a Monday, always a dreaded day, but usually we have this routine of kissing goodbye before he heads to work, and I stay behind because I work from home. That morning, though, he kissed me on the forehead and left without a backward glance. I was left standing in the hallway, feeling the sting of something missing. I told myself it was just a rushed moment, that he was late. But I knew. And over the next few weeks, the pattern solidified. Polite, warm, friendly Mark. But not once did he slip a hand around my waist or whisper anything suggestive. It was as though the entire concept of sex had vanished from our marriage. At first, I felt this weird relief that I wasn't being pressured to fake it again. Then came the guilt, and then the anger, which was the strangest part. Why was I mad at him? Why did I want to shake him and say, don't you still want me? It turned into this cycle in my head. Resentment that he wasn't pursuing me. Then shame for wanting him to pursue me when I'd signaled I wasn't interested. I tried to approach him a few times, but I couldn't get the words out. I'd open my mouth, see the way he looked at me with that gentle curiosity, and lose my nerve. Instead, I ask something mundane. Have you seen my keys? And watch the moment pass. One night, I dressed up in an outfit I used to wear in college, something that once turned heads. I wore it around the house while we had dinner, waiting to see if he'd notice. He did notice. He did notice. His eyes lingered, and I felt a flicker of hope. But all he said was, you look really nice tonight, and continued eating. I wanted to scream. That's it. You're not going to grab me or tease me or ask me to dance in the living room like you used to. But I was silent, letting my disappointment curdle into bitterness. After dinner, he did the dishes, and I found myself watching him trying to decode his calm. Was he doing this to punish me, or was he just respecting the boundary I'd set in a single careless act? It's the not knowing that drives me crazy. Sometimes I see a flash of sadness in his face, and I wonder if that sadness is me, or if he's just thinking about something else entirely. Did I become so distant that he lost interest, or is he simply waiting for me to say it's okay again? And I can't bring myself to do it, admit I messed up, that I'm the one who basically pushed him away. Because if I admit that, then I have to acknowledge how I've been chasing a thrill that might never have existed. What if I'm the type of person who always wants something more? In that moment, I started to realize maybe I was the one who was drifting first, and he just followed my lead. Now the big question is whether it's too late to turn back. Yet I can't help but think, if he truly loved me, wouldn't he fight for me? The doubt creeps in and I'm stuck in this gray area. Do I hate him for not fighting? Or do I hate myself for expecting him to wage war after I told him, in one misguided night, that I wanted no battle at all? I tried distracting myself with work, with errands, even with a new gym class. The more I avoided him, the more normal it became. We'd share dinner, watch a little TV, exchange idle chatter about the day. But gone was that subtle current that once sparked between us, that sense of closeness that might lead to a lingering touch or a playful look. It was like we were roommates who respected each other's space, carefully sidestepping any mention of the past. I started to think maybe this was the new normal, and a part of me wondered if it was better this way, no fights, no disappointments, just a calm acceptance that we'd become lukewarm. Except that calm was gnawing at me from the inside. Late at night, I'd curl up on my side of the bed, remembering when he used to spoon against me, how his warm breath on the back of my neck made me feel safe. Now he'd kiss me on the cheek, say goodnight, and roll to his own side. Some nights, I barely slept, haunted by the thought that maybe he was wide awake too, lost in his own swirling doubts. But I never found the courage to reach for him. I was too scared he'd pull away, or worse, that he wouldn't. For a while, I told myself I was the victim, that he'd just stopped trying and left me in the lurch. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't quite that simple. I'd seen the look on his face the moment I faked it, the moment he knew something was off. Could I really blame him for not wanting to cross a line I'd clearly drawn? I guess the reason it stings so much is that I always imagined if something ever threatened our intimacy, he'd push back, ask me if I was okay, try to fix it, challenge me to talk it out, but he didn't. He just receded. Like the tide going out, not with a slam of the door, but with the slow hush of water pulling away from shore. Did he decide I wasn't worth the trouble? Or did he decide he respected me too much to force himself on me when I showed disinterest? Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I replay all our tender moments, the goofy laughs, the road trips, the times we couldn't keep our hands off each other. Those memories float through my mind like phantoms, reminding me that something good once existed here. I'm the one who changed it, yet I keep wanting him to fix it. I spent an entire evening sipping tea on the couch, waiting for him to come sit beside me. He stayed in the kitchen, reading. We might as well have been in two different houses. And when I finally walked in, he looked up with the mildest curiosity, as though waiting to see if I needed something from him. I froze in the doorway, my heart pounding with all these things I wanted to say, but none of them left my lips. He gave me a half smile, the kind you give a colleague in an elevator, and returned to his book. And I stood there thinking, how did we end up here? And why can't I move? When I finally forced my feet forward, I felt like a stranger at my own home. Did he feel the same way, or was this the life he was willing to accept because I'd made him believe I wanted it? I woke up the next morning with a knot in my stomach. There was a moment when I watched him sleep and thought about reaching out, brushing the hair from his forehead like I used to. But my hand hovered in midair, paralyzed by fear. What if he opened his eyes, saw me, and politely asked, "Is something wrong?" That question, so mild and concerned, might break me. Or maybe it would do nothing at all. I found myself longing for an argument, something that would tear down this polite wall between us and show there was still passion underneath. So that day, I picked a fight, though I'd never admit it in so many words. I confronted him about the laundry, of all things, a stupid, minor thing that had never bothered me before. I complained he'd mixed colors incorrectly, which is absurd, because we typically don't care about those details. He just stood there, arms folded, listening calmly. I half expected him to snap back, to demand what was really going on, but he just apologized. It made me feel small. Later, I tried to push further, implying we needed to talk about us, but when he asked what I wanted to discuss, I lost my nerve. The conversation fizzled into silence. Even so, I watched his expression, hoping to see a flicker of frustration. Instead, I saw a hint of sadness and something else, resignation, maybe. Like he'd settled into the fact that I was distant, and there was no point in forcing me out of it. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding, and I asked him a direct question for once. "Do you not want me anymore?" He paused, looked at me with those thoughtful eyes, and said, "I don't want to pressure you." The words landed like a blow. It felt like he was reflecting my own guilt back at me. I hadn't expected that. I wanted him to say, "Of course I still want you," or "I miss you so much," or even "I'm done." Something definitive. Instead, I got a quiet, gentle echo of my own hesitation. I nodded and climbed under the covers, tears burning behind my eyes. He must have seen them, but he didn't push. He never pushes. He just let me cry silently into my pillow, and I hated him for it because a twisted part of me wanted to be confronted, to be told how deeply I'd hurt him, to be forced to confess all the ways I'd let us down. But that's not him. He's always respected my boundaries, sometimes so much that it hurts. I lay awake for hours, wondering if we were already too far gone or if I still had a chance to fix what I'd broken. Then I wondered if I was even willing to fix it. And that thought frightened me more than anything else, because if I wasn't sure I wanted to salvage us, who was I to expect him to chase after me? I tried to muster the courage to tell him everything one night. I'd been rehearsing a confession in my head all day. I'm sorry I lied. Sorry I pretended something I didn't feel. Sorry I pushed you away. But when the moment came and we were sitting across from each other at the dinner table, I ended up just asking how his day went. I could feel the words stuck in my throat, heavy and urgent, but no sound came. He answered simply, "It was fine," and we fell into that familiar silence. I stabbed at my food, not really tasting it, my heart pounding with frustration at myself. What was I so afraid of? That he'd say, "I know you faked it, and I'm tired of begging for your affection." Or maybe that he'd say he didn't care anymore. I realized I was terrified of hearing him confirm that we were beyond saving. After dinner, he lingered by the sink, washing dishes. I pretended to tidy up the kitchen, but really I was hovering, trying to find a crack in the silence that would let me slip in my apology. Eventually, I cleared my throat and said, "Mark?" He turned off the faucet, looked at me, the slightest tilt of his head. "Yes?" I felt my face flush. My chest tightened. It was like preparing to jump into icy water. Then I panicked. I mumbled something about a friend who might be visiting over the weekend. He nodded, said that was nice, turned back to the dishes. I stood there, hating myself. Later that night, I lay in bed, the confession still lodged in my throat, burning me from the inside out. I turned to face him, but he was already staring at the ceiling, lost in his own thoughts. I wondered if he was thinking about the same thing, about how he'd fallen into this pit and couldn't see a way out. Without looking at me, he said, "Are you okay?" That question again. So gentle. The question that could have opened a door if I'd had the guts to walk through it. But my own fear and pride locked me in place. "I'm fine," I answered, my voice cracking. He didn't push. Instead, he reached out, squeezed my hand, then let go. That small gesture undid me. I almost blurted out, "I'm not fine, I'm so sorry." But I stayed silent. I'm not sure why. Maybe because once you open the floodgates, you can't close them again. If I admitted that one lie, that one moment I told him a massive untruth, I'd have to confront every other unspoken resentment or disappointment that's been piling up. And maybe I was still clinging to the hope that we could just revert to normal if neither of us spoke the truth out loud. But the unspoken things were killing us both. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I wondered if maybe the moment for honesty had already passed us by. I lay awake the next morning, rehearsing yet again. I'd tell him I was sorry, that I loved him, that I wanted a chance to rediscover what we'd lost. My heart was racing and I felt a tight knot in my stomach. I rolled over, expecting to see him there, but the bed was empty and cold. The quiet hush of the house told me he was already downstairs. My resolve faltered. What if he was already checked out? I got dressed mechanically, each piece of clothing a thin armor against my own vulnerability. Downstairs, I found him sipping coffee and reading the news on his phone. He glanced up, offered a soft smile. "Morning," he said, placing a mug in front of me. I wanted to break the routine, to tell him I was sorry, really sorry, right then and there, but I felt awkward. Instead, I muttered a quiet thanks and took a sip, the bitter warmth doing nothing to soothe my anxious mind. As he scrolled on his phone, I studied his face for any sign of what he was feeling. But he was composed, almost serene. At least on the surface. Inside, I imagined he was every bit as restless as me, but maybe he'd gotten better at hiding it. Or maybe he'd moved beyond restlessness into acceptance. The idea that he might have let me go so gently made my stomach twist. I wanted him to be angry or jealous or something that indicated there was still fire in him for me. But he seemed so settled. I said his name softly, and he looked up, genuine concern in his eyes. But when I hesitated, he just waited, not pushing, not urging me on. That was worse than any scolding. I could feel the moments slipping away. Then his phone buzzed, and he gave me an apologetic glance before checking a message from work. I watched his fingers move across the screen, feeling that old irritation welling up. Why couldn't he just fight for me, or at least ask why I looked so miserable? Why was I the one who had to take this step when he seemed so at peace? My frustration boiled over, and I excused myself, leaving the kitchen abruptly. As soon as I was alone, I regretted it, but I couldn't bring myself to go back. I paced upstairs, muttering curses at myself, at him, at the ghost of who we used to be. I wondered if we'd simply become two lines running parallel, never intersecting, and if this was something I'd have to accept. Could I live with that? Or would it eat away at me until I snapped? At that moment, I realized I was close to snapping already. But I also realized I might be the only one capable of reversing course, if that was even possible. Except I was the one who'd started this whole thing. And every time I tried to fix it, I froze. A part of me suspected the reason I froze was because I didn't actually know if I wanted to fix it or if I wanted some kind of dramatic proof that we weren't broken. But drama isn't in his nature. He'd probably let me walk out the door if I insisted that's what I truly wanted. I thought about that possibility, trying to envision packing a suitcase and leaving. The mental image felt hollow, terrifying. But wasn't that what I'd effectively done already in a smaller, more insidious way? The question pressed in on me, and I couldn't find an answer that gave me any relief. That evening, something finally snapped. I decided I'd try one last time, but differently, no more half-confessions. I wanted to remind myself what it felt like to truly desire him, so I planned a nice dinner at home, candles lit, a bottle of wine, my hair carefully done. He came back from work, looking tired yet appreciative of the setting. We ate quietly, but there was a tension in the air I couldn't ignore. Every bite tasted bland because all I could think about was the moment I'd have to either tell him everything or let it slip away forever. When we finished, I reached across the table and took his hand, trembling slightly. He glanced at our joined hands, then up at me, as if asking silently if I was okay. I don't know how I mustered the courage, but I moved around the table, stood beside him, and leaned in for a kiss. He responded softly at first, then a little deeper. For a fleeting moment, I felt that spark again, like a whisper of what we used to have. My heart fluttered. "I miss you," I whispered against his lips, trying to pour everything I felt into those 3 words. The guilt, the longing, the desperation. His brow furrowed, and he gently pulled back, just enough to look into my eyes. "I'm here," he said softly, and it was so earnest it hurt. Something in me cracked open. "No, you're not," I said, voice trembling with the emotions I'd bottled up. "You haven't touched me in months. You haven't." I trailed off, unable to say the rest. He let out a slow breath, eyes cast down. "I stopped because I thought that's what you wanted. I didn't want to pressure you." There was that quiet acceptance again. But this time it stung worse than ever. I felt tears gather at the corners of my eyes. "You could have asked," I managed to choke out. His response was a rueful smile, and then he said something that shattered me. "I did ask in my own way. You kept saying you were tired, stressed, or just done." And then that night, he trailed off, but we both knew the night he meant the night I pretended. It felt like a punch to the gut, realizing he'd been hurting all this time, thinking he was doing me a kindness by staying away, while I'd been building resentment, blaming him for not persisting. Suddenly, I was angry, but the anger had nowhere to go. It was my fault as much as it was his, maybe more. I wanted to yell, to cry, to beg him to forgive me, but I was paralyzed by my own guilt. He saw the tears in my eyes, reached out, and brushed my cheek with his thumb. The gentleness undid me. My heart hammered and I wanted to collapse into him, but all I could do was stare at him and think, So this is what it feels like to lose something while it's still right in front of you. And for one terrifying second, I wondered if there was any chance we could turn back. Afterward, we moved to the living room. I could still feel the wine buzzing in my veins, or maybe it was just adrenaline from the confrontation. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, facing each other, both unsure of what to say next. Finally, he broke the silence. I never wanted to be a burden to you. It was such a simple statement, but it tore my heart. You're not, I replied, my voice trembling. It's me, I don't know what I'm doing. Tears threatened to spill again, and I felt ridiculous for crying so much. But I couldn't hold it anymore. I started rambling, telling him everything I bottled up, how I felt stifled, bored, and how I thought faking it would be easier than admitting I was disconnected. I admitted I was terrified he'd stop loving me if he knew I was so unsatisfied. With each word, I expected him to lash out, to accuse me of being ungrateful or selfish, but he just listened, quietly, intently. When I finished, he exhaled a long, shaky breath. I would have rather heard the truth, he said softly. Then be left wondering if I was the problem. The guilt slammed into me and I broke down, sobbing into my hands. He scooted closer, placed a hand on my back, and I could feel the warmth of him, the kindness that had always been there. It felt like the first real moment of closeness we'd had in ages, but it was tinged with so much regret. When I finally calmed enough to speak, I whispered, I'm sorry. He nodded, his eyes shining with his own unshed tears. Me too. I realized then that he wasn't blameless either, his silence, his retreat, all those moments he could have fought for us and didn't. But I also saw that none of this was black and white. We were two people who loved each other, but we'd quietly sabotaged our connection out of fear and miscommunication. I reached for his hand and he laced his fingers through mine, so familiar and yet so foreign. We didn't say anything for a while, letting the weight of our confession settle. Eventually he asked, so what now? I opened my mouth, but no words came. What did I want? I wanted to mend us, yet I wasn't sure if we could. Did we even remember how to be intimate without the cloud of doubt? I found myself staring at him thinking, I love you, but do I love you enough to fix what I broke? That question lingered, unspoken, as we sat there, connected by our hands, but separated by months of unspoken truths. And the scariest part was that I wasn't sure if we could bridge that gap or if this was a quiet farewell disguised as a conversation. Eventually, I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling his slow, steady breathing. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to hope, mingled with a deep fear that I might have come too late. And as my eyes closed, I wondered if he felt the same stirring of possibility, or if I was just projecting my own longing onto him. By the next morning, I think we both wanted to believe we could start again. We went through the motions, had coffee together, talked about our plans for the day. It was peaceful, but beneath that surface calm, I sensed a new tension, an awareness that we'd opened the door to something complicated. Every glance carried a question. Are we okay? Neither of us answered it directly. We just tried to act normal, which was almost comical considering how much had been said the night before. At one point, I found myself rambling about groceries, listing items we needed. Mark nodded patiently, but I could tell he was only half listening. It was as if we were both testing the waters, seeing if normalcy could still exist in the wake of our confessions. Eventually, he stood up, poured himself a second cup of coffee, and asked if I needed anything else. I just shook my head, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on my chest. After he left for work, I sank onto the couch, trying to figure out my next move. We'd made baby steps toward honesty, but I still wasn't sure if we'd undone the damage or just exposed it. Should I text him something sweet, something to remind him I still care? Should I plan another special evening, or should I give him space? I did none of those things, paralyzed by my own indecision. The day slipped by in a haze of half-focused work, my thoughts drifting back to him, and the nights we once shared with laughter and touch. Eventually, late in the afternoon, I realized something crucial. We needed to talk more, or we'd slip back into that silent acceptance. Yet the idea of talking more terrified me because each conversation had the potential to reveal we might not be salvageable. That evening, when he got home, I made dinner again, nothing fancy this time, just something warm and comforting. We ate quietly, the silence feeling both companionable and tense. Afterward, I forced myself to speak. So, about last night. He paused, a fork halfway to his mouth, then set it down carefully. Yeah, there was a tremor in my voice. I meant what I said. I really am sorry. He nodded, eyes flickering with something like understanding. But he also looked away, like he couldn't hold my gaze. I know, he replied softly. We lapsed into silence again. I felt my heart pounding, wanting to press for more assurance, more expression of how he felt. But the fear of pushing him away again clamped my throat shut. Finally, I asked in a small voice, Do you still want me? He hesitated, and in that moment, my world seemed to shrink to the space between us. When he finally spoke, it was measured, almost careful. I do, but I'm not sure what you want. I don't want to step over a line anymore. I swallowed hard, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. I'm scared, I admitted, voice trembling, of messing this up again, of hurting you more. He reached across the table, took my hand in his. His thumb gently stroked the back of it. I'm scared too, he said. And there we were, two people who loved each other, afraid to move forward or backward. I wished I could freeze that moment, keep us in that fragile place of mutual confession. But time pressed on, and I knew we'd have to make a choice eventually. The question was, would either of us be brave enough to make it? When I woke up this morning, I found him already gone, a note by the coffee maker that said he had an early meeting. He'd signed it with a simple heart. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental in a way, like a cautious hint that he was willing to try. My chest filled with a mix of hope and dread, because I knew how easy it would be for either of us to slip into old habits. All day long, I wondered what I'd do that evening, how I'd approach him, whether I'd finally be able to articulate what I wanted. But as the hours dragged on, my certainty wavered. Every time I thought about baring my soul, I felt that old fear creep back. What if he had decided we were better off as polite strangers than a couple struggling to reconnect? By the time he came home, the anxiety was thrumming through me like a steady pulse. We had dinner again, barely touching on anything deeper than how his meeting went. After the plates were cleared, I followed him into the living room. He looked tired, but his eyes had that familiar gentleness. Without waiting for him to ask, I sat down beside him. We can't keep pretending, I said softly. He gave a small nod as though he agreed, but didn't know how to proceed. Summoning all my courage, I blurted, I still love you. I never stopped. I got lost. His expression flickered with relief, but also wariness. I love you too, he said, voice low. But I don't know how to fix this. I felt a surge of frustration, not at him, but at the situation. Neither do I admitted. But maybe we can try. Like, start small, he swallowed, seemed to consider it. I'm willing if you really are. That was the moment, the crossroad where I could have made a real commitment to rebuilding us. But the lingering doubt clung to me. What if we try and fail? What if, after all this, we realize we've grown too far apart? I felt tears prickle again, the weight of uncertainty settling over my shoulders. And then he did something unexpected. He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, a tender gesture reminiscent of our early days. I wanted to lean in and kiss him, but I wasn't sure if that was too much too soon. Instead, I let the silence envelop us, hoping he'd make the next move. Eventually, he just pressed his forehead to mine, and we sat there like that, breathing in each other's closeness. It felt like a fragile truce, a pause in the battle we'd been waging against ourselves. And in that pause, I realized something. Maybe there isn't going to be a clear fix, a neat resolution, or a romantic movie moment where we know everything will be okay. Maybe it'll just be us, stumbling forward, learning to trust again, or maybe drifting further apart if we can't. The uncertainty was terrifying. But for the first time in ages, I felt like we at least stood on the same ground, both aware that the next step belonged to both of us. And as we pulled away from each other, I couldn't help wondering if the courage we needed was something we'd find together, or if this was merely a temporary ceasefire before the final goodbye. He offered me a half smile, and I tried to return it, though tears still clung to my lashes. I could feel the weight of everything we'd been through hovering between us, demanding a resolution we might not be ready to give. Part of me wanted to collapse into his arms, to pretend all was forgiven and forget the distance that had grown. But the truth was, we were only beginning to face the damage, and it wouldn't vanish overnight. So instead, I squeezed his hand and stood up, murmuring something about needing a moment. He watched me with a mix of understanding and concern, but didn't protest when I slipped upstairs to the quiet sanctuary of our bedroom. Now I'm sitting on the edge of the bed we once shared so effortlessly, trying to process everything. Outside, the evening light is fading, and the shadows are growing long on the walls. A reminder that time is still passing us by. I don't know if we'll ever recover the ease we had in the early days, or if we even want the same things anymore. But at least the truth is out there, fragile and tentative as it is. I can't help thinking about how close we came to losing each other without any dramatic fights or heated accusations, just a gradual unraveling rooted in fear and misunderstanding. Maybe that's how most relationships end, quietly, with a slip of honesty replaced by silence. But we haven't ended yet. There's a small spark, a glimmer of possibility that we might piece things together if we're willing to do the work. Whether or not either of us will fully commit is still hanging in the air. And that uncertainty is both terrifying and oddly thrilling. I can hear him downstairs, moving around, probably washing the dishes again. The normalcy of that routine tugs at my heart. I think about the fake orgasm, how a single lie can spiral into something huge, transforming a momentary desire for distance into a chasm of silence, all because I was afraid. I've learned that lesson the hard way, but learning it doesn't guarantee I'll do better tomorrow. I might still freeze up, hesitate, choke on my words. He might still see the doubt in my eyes and step back instead of forward. We might fail, yet something in me refuses to give up completely. Maybe that's the beauty of love, the chance to try even when every sign screams we should run. Tonight, I'll go back downstairs, maybe settle on the couch, maybe invite him to watch some show we both pretend to like. Maybe we'll talk, or maybe we'll just sit in that shared silence that's becoming so familiar. The difference now is that I know what's at stake. I know that if I want him to stay, if I want us to heal, I have to meet him in the middle, share my fears, and let him share his. And if we're both willing to do that, maybe, just maybe, there's a path forward. I can't promise a happy ending, not to myself or to him, but for the first time in a long while, I feel like there's a whisper of hope stirring in this house. And as I stand up to head downstairs, I catch a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. My eyes are still red, my face drawn, but there's a flicker of determination there. I'm not ready to walk away. The question is, has my moment of truth come too late, or can we still find our way back to each other before the silence claims us for good?